Far from Home, The Emancipation of Kairo Foster, or Confessions of an Interstate Traveler, for Adam. Our whole being is nothing but a fight against the dark forces within ourselves. To live is to war with trolls in heart and soul. To write is to sit in judgment on oneself. Henrik Ibsen. Chapter 1. Somnambulism. Sorrow doth darken all the universe. Its creatures are involved in pain and woe. Helpless they cry, and no one hears or aids. Dark, dark is life, and none its meaning know. James Allen, Aeolus. The axiom, to live is to suffer, is a heartbreaking lesson to learn. Worse yet is when that lesson is senselessly instilled into you as a child by those you love and trust the most. Such was my lot in life. Born under an Aquarian sun, the most remarkable aspect of my childhood is that I even had one. At 10 years old, my mother informed me that during the first trimester of her pregnancy, she wavered between having me and having me aborted. I suppose the promised luxury of subsidized housing is what finally convinced her to let me live. And so, 5 months later, I was born premature, covered in vernix caseosa, yet suffering from crack cocaine withdrawal. It wasn't until I was 12 that I met my father. He came to see me the very day he was released from prison. The visit was as short as the occasional birthday card he sent me over the years, and equally as touching. "You're coming to live with me whenever I get out of the halfway house," he told me. "I'm going to take you out of this filthy ghetto and make a man out of you, son." Then he turned around and disappeared from my life again. "Mom, why was my dad in prison?" I asked upon re-entering the apartment. "I still haven't told you that?" she asked, blowing a thick cloud of smoke into the air, knowing good and well that she had never told me. She leaned forward, stubbing out the cigarette butt in the red plastic ashtray which was perpetually overflowing. Then she took a long pull from her beer bottle while considering whether or not to answer my question. She looked at me as she lit up another Newport, closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, then said, "Ask your daddy. He might tell you, seeing as how he's going to be a part of your life now." 6 months after meeting my father, he made good on one of his promises to me. I moved out of Mom's apartment in the filthy ghetto and into Dad's trailer in an equally, if not more, filthy trailer park. During the week I would live with my dad, going to school in his district, and on Friday nights I would get dropped off at Mom's, staying there until Sunday evening when Dad would come pick me back up. It was around this period of my life when I discovered the joy of reading. I became a major bookworm, choosing to seclude myself in my room with my library books, rather than socialize with my parents or the neighborhood kids. I particularly enjoyed reading about magical realms hidden in plain sight which the heroes could gain access to by walking through wardrobes or brick walls and train stations. My absolute favorite was Peter Pan, though. He ran away from home on the day he was born, and for that I envied him greatly. Fitting in with kids my age was not worth the hassle. In the trailer park, the white kids would pick on me for having a black mother, and in the ghetto, the black kids would pick on me for having a white father. In their eyes, I was always less than, simply because of my mixed race. I never understood the reason behind this, and most likely never will. It isn't like I chose what color skin I wanted to be born with. My childhood wasn't all gray skies and rain. There were a few bright spots here and there. Like when I was 7 and my mom went to rehab for 3 months. Those were probably the best 3 months of my childhood. During that time, I got to go live with my grandparents. And oh, how I loved that. With them, I was never ashamed of my skin color. Rather, they made me believe my mixed race was something to be proud of. "There's my little mulatto man," Grandma would say by way of greeting every morning when I walked into the den. And there would be no alternative but for me to run and jump into her warm, soothing embrace. "You're going to need a stick before too long, Kairo," Grandpa would tell me. That's the only way you'll be able to keep all of the girls off you. My grandpa filled the void created by my absent father in the most spectacular way. In fact, all of my fondest childhood memories involve him in some way. He was a bear of a man with a big booming voice, but he lived for his family and would do just about anything to make us happy. He used to sit me on his lap and we would eat ice cream together. "One spoonful for Kairo," he would say, scooping up the creamy, delicious coldness, holding the spoon while I ate my bite. "Now 1 spoonful for Grandpa," he would say, eating 2 or even 3 bites, as Grandma looked on in mock indignation. After my mother graduated from rehab, I moved back in with her. She successfully kicked her crack cocaine habit, of which I am immensely proud of her for. She began using alcohol as a substitute, which wasn't so bad, I guess. After all, the apartment was no longer permeated by the stench of burnt rubber. That, plus the weekly influx of neighborhood men who would come over late at night, trickled down to a minimum. As the years went by, I began to see less and less of my grandparents. This was doubly true once my father forced his way into my life. His was a world of darkness, and it didn't take long for me to become acquainted with the demons that haunted him. He had a violent side and was mean as a water moccasin. Upon living with him, my days soon became filled with fear and confusion. I was afraid of him, afraid of what he might do next, and utterly confused as to why he didn't love me. My father was abusive, but it was much more than that. He received some sort of perverse pleasure from humiliating me, and would show up at my school with the sole purpose of inflicting pain. One of his favorite weapons was a rat's tail, a wet washcloth he would twist up and whip me with. Eyes flashing with anger, he would lead me to the school bathroom with a demented smile on his face, as if he just couldn't wait to begin punishing me. For what? I honestly don't know. It seemed like this punishment would stretch on for hours, each slashing strike sending water running down my thighs, evoking images of my flesh being torn open and my blood being spilled. As my cries rang out and echoed around the school bathroom, I just knew an adult would come in to save me. None ever did. My father was crafty, highly skilled in the art of hatred, and physical abuse was just one act in his malicious repertoire. In matters of psychological warfare, he was exceptional. He excelled in nonverbal torture techniques and was a master at manipulation. If there was ever a university with specialty degrees in inducing traumatic experiences, my father most certainly would have attended and graduated summa cum laude. He would go weeks on end without uttering a single word to me, only to break his vow of silence by telling me how worthless I was, or by screaming into my face that my mother was only a crack whore who enabled me to be substandard in life. And he was insanely convinced that one day I would thank him for the way he treated me, that I would thank him for turning me into a man. Because of this, I began to withdraw from external reality by spending most of my waking hours constructing elaborate universes where I could live free of fear and anxiety. I created fictitious families in these alternate realities, families that were loving and kind and allowed me, no, encouraged me to be a kid. The households in these fantasy worlds were stress-free. My mother wasn't an alcoholic, nor was I expected to compensate for my father's emotional instability. In my imagination, I actually had friends at school, and nobody ever called me whoreson or half-breed. I was still 12 at this time, and I wet the bed fairly often. Nothing would make my father more angry than when I did this. One night, I woke him up to tell him I had wet the bed, and he flew into a blind rage. He jumped out of bed as if possessed, picked up a wooden chair, and slammed it against the floor repeatedly until it was no longer a chair, just pieces of splintered wood scattered haphazardly around the room. He looked into my eyes as I cowered against the wall, and told me I would have to be punished for breaking his favorite chair. He made me strip off my urine-soaked boxers and hand them to him. He then wound up like a major league pitcher and pegged me square in the face with my still dripping underwear. Then he promised that if I ever wet the bed again, I would have to drink a glass of my own piss. I lived with my father 5 days a week for 2 years, and every single day I was expected to perform 1,000 push-ups and jumping jacks. I am sure I never accomplished this. The number was just figurative, symbolizing my persistent inadequacy to reach his goals. My alarm would go off at 5 a.m. I would get dressed for school, eat a bowl of cereal, then spend the next hour doing physical training while waiting for the bus. Once school let out, Dad was always there waiting for me at the bus stop, where immediately upon disembarking, my PT would recommence. This dragged on relentlessly until one day, by chance, my grandma noticed the swollen red marks on my lower back, the marks of my father's rat tail. After further inspection, it became apparent that these marks extended from my lower back down to the middle of my thighs. My mother and grandparents questioned me repeatedly about these marks until I finally broke down and told them they were inflicted by my father on a weekly basis for the past 2 years. My father's reign of terror in my life was finally coming to an end. A complaint was filed with Child Protective Services, and an agent came out to interview my mother and I. I never did get the opportunity to ask my father why he spent 12 years in prison, but as it turned out, I didn't have to. I learned the truth as my mother recounted our family history to the caseworker in between drags of her cigarette. As she told her story, I was afforded a brief glimpse into her soul, and I began to understand why she had been so ambivalent about giving birth to me. One of the reasons my life was so full of sorrow was revealed to me on that day. You see, I was even conceived in suffering. I have rape to thank for my existence. It wasn't until many years went by that I realized why my mother sought solace from a bottle. I was an ever-present reminder of the most painful night of her life. Every time she looked at me, she saw the shadow of the man who raped her. This is the hand life dealt me. Many sleepless nights have found me lying in bed, staring up into the darkness, while considering taking up the entire cursed deck and throwing all the cards away in angst. The only thing that has held me back from that is the uncertainty of where those cards might fall. Once my father learned about the CPS case against him, he moved to North Louisiana, never to face any consequences for violating his own child's trust and safety. The shame, confusion, and misguided hatred he left me with became a part of my identity for the next 10 years. Once I turned 13, I was turned on to cannabis by some neighborhood kids, and thus began my long-term love affair with Mary Jane. To be filled with so much pain for so long and to finally find a distraction from the turmoil within me was beautiful. I began to self-medicate and spent as many waking hours as I could comfortably numb. From pot, I progressed to alcohol and Xanax. Going to school fucked up was clearly a recipe for disaster, so I would skip school to get loaded with my new friends. Before long, my unexcused absences began to pile up, and the truancy officers came calling. So you mean to tell me you've been getting dressed for school and walking to the bus stop with your book bag just to fool me into thinking you're going to class? My mother asked after the truancy officers left our apartment. What could I say? That was exactly what I had been doing. And so, after that, my mother would personally drive me to school and sit in the car watching until I walked through the front doors. Once school let out, my mother would be in the parking lot waiting for me. Needless to say, I was grounded, confined to my room from that point on, which meant no more getting stoned with the neighborhood kids. Forced to return to school and deprived of my beloved substances, the inner anguish reappeared in my life like a long-lost friend. My entire being was just one big ball of pain wrapped up in innumerable strands of depression, anger, anxiety, and hopelessness. These strands, which had been held together through my substance abuse, now began to come unraveled. Suspension after suspension after suspension ensued with the culmination of my acting out, leading to my expulsion from both the charter school system and the alternative school system. My mother didn't know what to do with me, but not being able to take off from work to keep an eye on me, I was left to my own devices during the week. I fell back in with the neighborhood kids and immediately started using drugs and alcohol again. "The route you're going, son," my mother would scold me during the evenings as she drank from her beer bottle. You're either going to end up dead or in jail. Her words were meaningless to me, though. Stray wisps of smoke which disappeared seconds after perceiving them. All that mattered to me was blocking out the pain, even if only for a few hours. That summer, I climbed through my bedroom window every night around midnight. The kids I was running with introduced me to car hopping, which was what they called burglarizing unlocked cars at night. We would walk down all the streets in the neighborhood surrounding ours, lifting door handles until we found an unlocked car. Glove boxes, center consoles, even the trunks, no place was safe from us. Around 4 in the morning, we would all meet back up to divvy up the stolen loot. Mostly cell phones, GPSs, every now and then a watch or a pair of shoes, and even the occasional handgun. Our nightly escapades paved the way for us to continue getting stoned during the day. When I was 15, the police barged into my room early one morning and arrested me for possession with intent to sell 2 ounces of pot. I wish I had a somewhat justifiable excuse for selling weed, like I was only doing it to purchase my school uniforms or help my mom with the rent. But the truth is, I sold weed strictly to support my habit. Weed was my medicine of choice. By then I had almost completely forsaken alcohol and benzos because of how fuzzy they made me feel after coming down. The come down from weed was much lighter, and the high itself was more enjoyable. While high, I never contemplated my life's unanswerable questions, like why my father didn't love me, or why my mother was slowly killing herself with alcohol. Instead, I found myself laughing at the most trivial things, like the expression on the neighbor's dog's face, or how I couldn't remember what I went into my room to grab. I hardly ever laughed while sober. Weed made being alive somewhat bearable. Ungovernable was the verdict that was reached in family court 3 months after my arrest. To this day, I am still unsure to whom that term applied, me or my mother. Besides smoking and selling weed, I was just as likely to skip school altogether as I was to get suspended or expelled. My destructive means of coping with reality were my subconscious pleas for help. I was still just a hurt and confused kid, but I thought of myself as a man. There wasn't anything my poor mother could tell me. The court's verdict came after my mother told the judge that she had moved into a 1-bedroom apartment while I was in juvie and didn't want me living with her anymore. Talk about a revelation. Something else that was revealed to me on that day? My mother was the person who snitched on me for selling weed. She called them to our apartment and gave them permission to arrest me as I slept securely in my room. The judge ordered that I be sent to a group home for wayward youth. I felt the transformation take place as I sat right there in the courtroom. I had officially devolved from my previous state of damaged goods into nothing more than discarded refuse. I was shipped off to a group home an hour and a half away. The state-funded house was infested with roaches and mice, and many nights saw me going to bed hungry because the staff expected the boys to fend for themselves. When I was 16, I ran away from the group home. I still remember that day as the most painful day of my miserable existence. A staff member came into the day room and told me to get dressed. I asked what was going on and was informed that my grandfather was losing his battle against prostate cancer. In fact, he was on his deathbed and didn't have much longer to live. The hour-and-a-half trip to the hospital was a blur. I remember walking through the lobby in a haze, completely numb and detached from all external perception. I was an outside observer, watching the events transpire from an impersonal vantage. My consciousness floated along behind me as I entered the cancer ward's waiting room. Mom and Grandma looked up as I walked in. The air was thick with pain, and I was forced to wade through it toward my family. Not a word was spoken, but I already knew. I didn't make it in time. My mother saw the realization take place in my eyes. "You can still go in and say goodbye," she told me. That's when the dam broke and the tears cascaded violently down my face. "What's the point?" I screamed and lurched out of the waiting room as quickly as I could. I tore out of the hospital and ran through the parking lot, seeking to put as much distance between myself and the pain as possible. But no matter how far I ran, there I was. There was no escaping this world of heartache and suffering I had been born into, only the bitter tug-of-war between denial and acceptance. The next 8 years were, for me, a revolving door, constantly rotating between homelessness and incarceration. At 19, I was arrested again for possession with intent, and with no money to make bond or hire a lawyer, I sat in jail for 11 months before copping out to the first deal I was offered. 5 years on probation, with a 10-year sentence suspended above me like the proverbial Damoclean sword. It was unwise for me to accept such an outrageous sentence, especially considering I was a first offender, but I was just ready to get out of jail. Even homelessness is better than being incarcerated. Lacking a solid support system, it was inevitable that I would violate my probation and be sent back to prison to back up that 10-year sentence. The only question was, how long would it take? The answer, less than 90 days. I served 28 months in prison before being released on parole. My time inside was divided between self-improvement classes and church services. It was definitely a turning point in my life, to learn that there is a God who loves me regardless of my past, who accepts me even if my family does not. I studied the scriptures voraciously, soaking up the word like algae does sunlight. I was amazed to learn that there was someone named Jesus who had suffered more than I had. Upon my release, I was sent to a halfway house where I realized and was sickened by the fact that I was following in my father's footsteps. I began waiting tables at a popular restaurant, going to the gym 5 days a week, and I even started modeling and walking in fashion shows. Outwardly, it seemed as if my life had turned itself around and that I was finally on the road to becoming a contributing unit of society. Inwardly, though, I was still the messed up little boy of 13 years earlier who experienced his father's betrayal, quickly followed by his mother's abandonment. The pain, the depression, the anger, all were still there, lurking just beneath my smiling facade. But now, a new element was being introduced to my psyche: narcissism. The time I spent in the gym watching my muscles expand and contract, coupled with my newly acquired image of being a runway model, inflated my ego quicker than an auctioneer could solicit bids. I was empty inside, and the way I figured it was, if nobody else could love me, at least I could love myself. And what a skewed picture of love that was. Being on parole prevented me from using my medicine of choice to mask the soul-clenching ache which was my running mate. So I turned to alcohol to fulfill this need. After several months of spending all my tip money on drinks every night, I realized I was following in my mother's footsteps. This served only to depress me even more, and I retreated even deeper into the bottle. My life was a downward spiral with no end in sight. As my local modeling career started to gain steam, I began to entertain thoughts of heading to New York City or Hollywood to pursue modeling full-time. But with being on parole for the next 6 years, this was little more than another elaborate fantasy. That is, until a spontaneous trip to New Orleans convinced me to bring my fantasy to life. After walking around the French Quarter for several hours, I made my way to Jackson Square, where I had the pleasure of running into a merry band of travelers. This ragtag family of misfits were lounging around reading tarot cards, and a carefree, hedonistic exuberance for life seemed to emanate from them. I was immediately drawn to their aura, like a June bug to an electric lamp. They were from all over the country, and had forsaken the stereotypical societal lifestyle to follow their hearts on a quest for love and adventure while still young. They must have sensed my wanderlust, because they spent the majority of our encounter trying to convince me to do the same. One of the young nomads fanned out her tarot deck, and I pulled a card at random, the Fool. She explained how the card was extremely significant for me. She pointed out the number 0 at the top of the card and told me this represented where I currently was in life, poised between an ending and a beginning. She equated me with the young man depicted on the card, who is shown walking along a mountainous trail, knapsack slung over his shoulder. You are on your way, she told me. Your bag is packed and you are unconcerned with possible dangers. Your old life is over and your new life is set to begin. I must admit, packing up and hitting the road toward a new life was definitely intriguing. If nothing else, the young travelers gave me something to think about. During the drive back to Baton Rouge, I weighed the pros and cons that came along with packing up and heading off into the unknown. On the one hand, I figured, I'm on parole, so sooner or later a warrant will be issued for my arrest. On the other hand, I'm on parole until I'm 31. If I don't take advantage of my youth now, I will never have the opportunity. Besides, nothing except misery has been my experience in Louisiana. The idea of taking my fate into my own hands and creating my own destiny greatly excited me. I was sold, my bag was packed, and I was on my way. At midnight I would be Hollywood bound, a fugitive en route to the Golden Coast with dreams of making it big in the City of Angels. As I considered my future, an unfamiliar emotion filled my heart with warmth. I call it optimism, but you can call it what it may have truly been: naivety.